Please welcome to the stage Peter Seligmann of Sylvania and our esteemed panel.
Well, welcome. It's good to be with the three of you, all distinguished in your lives and your careers and what you've achieved. You know, societies today all across this planet are faced with enormous stress, much of it geopolitical, and of course some of that ties directly into the threat caused by deteriorating environmental conditions that forces migration, interferes with food production, creates enormous challenges for families, for businesses, for governments, for all societies. And yet, despite the fact that we have had 30 annual discussions around addressing climate change, as someone who has participated in many of those, I've heard much of conversation and actually not that much effective delivery. In fact, extinctions are higher, production of food more difficult, intensification of storms more difficult. And so my question to all of you as we get started is what are those obstacles? Why are we not making the progress, and what would you suggest we do to remedy that? And President Duque, you've led a country. You're a very important member of the board of directors of Conservation International. You've devoted your life to finding answers and solutions, not only nationally, but really globally. What would you do? You know, if you had the authority, the positioning to be able to change, whether it's the effectiveness of business in this or the effectiveness of governmental policy, what are the actions that you would recommend and you would embrace? And let's just start off with that, and then we can go from there.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. It's also a pleasure for me to be in this panel with you, with Prime Minister Philip. We worked together and we were both in office with Kathleen, and especially being in Concordia in this 15th anniversary. So I would say there has to be a combination of elements, starting with countries to embrace the sound regulation this requires. And I had an experience when I was in office. We were able to pass unanimously in Congress the Climate Action Bill. So we defined what actions should every sector embrace in order for us to meet the national determined contributions. I think that's important. The second thing is to have taxonomies that as countries we're able to showcase every single policy intervention that would allow the markets to see the investments, not only with eagerness, but with transparency. And third, and this is what I see the biggest opportunity, is we need to create market-driven, nature-based solutions that are able to mobilize in a massive scale the capital this requires. And I'll give you an example. Africa has to invest $2.8 trillion in the next decade in order to meet the NDCs, and Latin America is a little bit higher than that. Resources from a fiscal perspective are not available. We don't have the fiscal space, we don't have the indebtedness capacity. Philanthropy can provide some resources, but it's going to be always falling short on that particular need. And the same thing happens with bilateral donors. So we need to create a mechanism in which the global north, through the offsets that they can purchase through the carbon credit markets, are able to connect that liquidity with the projects that are available in the global south. And that will help to mobilize resources for the Amazon, that will help us create more coral nurseries in the Caribbean, that can help us to do more plantation of mangroves, that can help us be more intelligent in the way that we deploy capital for that purpose. And I'll finish by saying that the great bet for COP30 is going to be the Tropical Forest Forever Facility. And it has to be able to really move beyond pledges, have the right capital, and be able to create that kind of instrument. This is a practical way in which we can serve the need that countries like ours have, but with the right policies and being able to connect the markets and capital with the transparency this requires.
Thank you. So let's just follow up on that, Prime Minister Davis. You have been leading a very significant, important small island nation. And the small island nations are really the canaries in the coal mine. The water level's rising, the storm intensification. So it's a real and present danger. And yet there's been conversation about financing coming from public sources for 30 years. My first question is, how much of that are you actually seeing? And the next is since I'm kind of anticipating that it hasn't flown, that you haven't gotten it, what's the option? And what are your ideas?
Thank you very much for bringing us back together. It's good to see you. Let me just say that I concur with all remarks made earlier by my friend. The elephant in the room, before I get to a specific question, truly is political change. The enemy to progress and the canceling and the postponing of progress made in the climate change era has been political change. And it's not just political change in the United States, political change in many countries. The change of political ideology, idiosyncrasies of leaders have been the enemy to progress because they all come in with certain views and idiosyncrasies about climate change, and the attempt is always to reverse what others have done. A mechanism, that's one of the obstacles that you spoke about earlier. So a mechanism have to be devised by the global community to prevent rollbacks because of change in countries. Political change, and that has been one of my pet peeves for a number of years. And so far as what we do with financing, for small island developing states, financing has been the challenge because we are the vulnerable ones. We are most impacted by the consequences of climate change. We find ourselves in a cycle of debt because we have to borrow. Every time there's a disaster, we have to borrow. We don't have the donors. And then so we are weighed down by debt. I can say to you, in the last 10 years, or last 10 years, my country has had 4 hurricanes, category 4 and 5 hurricanes, costing my country billions of dollars. More than 40% of my national debt I could link directly to recovery efforts following a disaster of hurricanes. But how do we recover? We have to borrow. And we just don't borrow for recovery now. That is exacerbated by the fact that our the risk factor, causes us to pay now for future events because of our risk factor. It shows up in the interest rates for borrowing. It shows up in insurance premiums for coverage. And that's part of the challenge. So I think it was in about 2015, it was decided that $100 billion was required to assist. 100 billion was to go into this climate fund. 15 years later, what do we have? That has been supplemented by the loss and damage fund. Has that been activated, operationalized? No. A lot of talk over the years, but nothing has happened. And the challenge is, even though the funds are there, we are unable to access it because of all the hurdles that's put in the way. the hurdles are put there because I think the funds are not there to get there, to provide the assistance that small island development states require. As I mentioned in the last COP, the pittance that has been put towards loss and damage was just there was to avoid what I call noise pollution. The noise being our voices about what is happening or not happening, instead of investing in the gas pollution that we want them to. And until we reach the point to putting into action what we are saying, we are still far, far away from providing for us in what I call the global south the required capital to protect ourselves, our lives and our livelihoods.
So if you think about that, I just want to follow up on that. You know, I, for one, am very skeptical that public funding at scale is ever going to arrive. I mean, it's like there's a book on a Tendon Godot, Waiting for Godot. I mean, and that's, I think we're waiting. And the reason is so many countries have their own challenges and issues, and everybody's running in debt in any case. So when you talk about market solutions, one of the things that's happened in the Bahamas, there's been this acknowledgement that there's a massive amount of seagrass.
Yes.
So my question really are you banking or hoping that there will be an evolution of a carbon market that can really generate revenue at scale?
Well, you know, what I've been saying to my fellow leaders in this, it says we have to forget the global north and we have to work be more innovative ourselves. Yes, the Bahamas, an archipelago spread over 140,000 square miles of water. It is said that we have at least 40% of the world's seagrass in our waters. And we have been, and it's also said that it is about 8 times more potent than the rainforest in absorbing carbon. And yes, we are now in the process of monetizing that. We have set up the legislative regime. We have set up all of the emission registry to get it done, and have plotted at least, we have 8 plots that's now before Bureau for verification. And hopefully by the end of this year, we might start seeing, we'll see on a platform to raise some funds.
Good.
Now what I say is that it is said that if it's 40% of the world's seagrass, and there's some study that suggests that the worth of the carbon credit for the seagrass worldwide is about 800 billion. But I only need 10% of that.
Good. It's always good to leave something on the table. Kathleen, you have been leading the sustainability efforts at Walmart for
12 years.
12 years. I was going to underestimate it at 10. And in the time that you have done that, you, I believe, have found that it has really been in the enlightened self-interest of Walmart to focus in on encouraging your supply chain to do things in a different way. How has that affected your business? And can you just give us some examples of that?
Yeah. So thank you very much, Peter, for having me here, and thank you for your remarks. Maybe I can provide some examples from the different part of the ecosystem. So as a retailer, Walmart is a retailer. We sell food, apparel, general merchandise for the home, things for day-to-day living in different countries around the world. And as a retailer of products that have ingredients that go back to nature, it's in our interest to make sure that there's surety of that supply. So just on that level alone. But obviously, as citizens of the planet, our customers, our associates, we're in communities, we've got a shared interest in solving the big challenges of our time, and certainly around climate and nature and economic prosperity. And so what we're trying to work on is through our sourcing and through our philanthropy, can we make a difference to being able to still provide food for the world and livelihoods for producers, whether those are farmers or fishermen or what have you, local communities, but in the context of the planetary boundaries. And that entails a pretty big shift in a few areas for a retailer like us. So one would be sourcing commodities in a way that has more sustainable production at source, where we're working with nature. So for example, rice from Arkansas. So we're working with farmers to use less water, less chemical inputs, have better yields. You end up with lower emissions. So different irrigation practices, different growing practices, you get lower emissions. You get less nutrient runoff and more conservation of the wetlands in the surrounding areas. You get better yields for the farmer and more income for the farmer. And that rice is our great value opening price point, very affordable rice. So we aren't asking the customer to pay more for something sustainable. We've rewired the way the production works to make that true. Or Pacific Island tuna, you're talking about small island nations. So the Republic of the Marshall Islands decided that they needed to participate in a different way in the fishery economy and have their own fishery. So have been creating the capacity to do that with vessels and processing and so on. And we came in with our purchase order as an off-taker with longer term assurance and contracted price for the output of that fishery, which again goes into our great value tuna. And that fishery can have higher environmental standards around bycatch, overfishing, all those things, dockside unloading, better human rights standards for the people on the vessels. And a portion of the proceeds are earmarked to be reinvested in coastal restoration. So again, you've got economic outcomes, social, environmental working together in a different approach, market economy for sourcing. And then if we kind of continue on the spectrum toward pure conservation, we've been trying to participate in a couple of different ways, mostly through our philanthropy, to kickstart the kind of scale things you guys are talking about. So, as you said, philanthropy is not going to solve the problem of the capital you need, but what we can do is put in some seed funding to kickstart some things that then can create value for reinvestment in nature-based solutions. So one example would be in Ghana, where through the LEAF Coalition and our participation there, it's a project similar to what you were talking about with the seagrass possibility there in the Bahamas. So for them, it's the high integrity carbon credits that can come from reforestation and conservation of the forest, with the proceeds of those credits to be reinvested to do things like build out more cocoa growing in degraded lands, local social economic benefits, and then that can then allow them to expand what they're doing and really have market forces kick in. Or ARPA in Brazil. So that's an investment that we're participating in. It's 66 million acres of conservation and another 7 million of restoration. And that can also, through investments in solar, in energy and so on, provide livelihoods for local people in a way that creates an economic engine that doesn't require deforestation for people to have their livelihoods. So there are things like that happening through business, and I think in concert with the larger scale initiatives that you're talking about, that's the sort of rewiring of economic systems that we need for conservation.
Did you want to add something to that, President Duque?
I believe that connection of having sustainable aggregated value chains are going to be very important to protect the tropical forests, and it's going to be very important to protect the Amazon. So if you listen to what Kathleen has described, if you're able to work with the Amazonic indigenous communities, and instead of having the wrong incentives for the destruction of the Amazon, you start working with camu camu, acai, copo azul, those Amazonic fruits that can engage into an aggregated value chain, the indigenous communities will be more empowered to preserve, to conserve, and have an income that would allow to progress along the years, even in their own conditions of life. So I think that market connection is important, but also I think on the corporate side, for example, for Walmart has to reduce their footprint, but at the same time, they have to be able to use offsets, and if they can finance projects from the Amazon and from other tropical places in the world or from the Caribbean, I think that will be a good way to mobilize that capital without having to clash with the fiscal spaces that is pretty limited today in the government.
And I should mention, we're actually not using offsets. So these things that we're doing, we're actually retiring the credits. It's through philanthropy.
Yeah, I mean, but you could still use the
I think
the
some
offsets
companies
as well.
it's very helpful.
Yeah.
For the very hard to abate sectors, it's a good solution.
Yes.
It would be really useful if nature-based carbon offsets actually could be
Of course.
comfortably verified and if there's
Yeah.
the right data set. As we just wrap up, I want to ask you, you are living in a small island nation. This challenge is extraordinarily complicated. If you were to kind of wave that wand and say, this is the expertise and the training that you'll have for your people to be able to design and lead this, what are the skills? What are the skills that are the most important for addressing this complex challenge that the Bahamas and so many other nations are facing?
Well, I think it is a complex issue. And when you talk about upskilling your people to meet the challenges that they face in respect to, it has to be in renewable sources. And any training in that area is a necessary component to, at the end of the day, the common theme here, as we have been saying, is lowering our carbon footprints. And how do we do that? And I think that's, and of course, money is required to assist that. And the talent and ingenuity of our people to understand and to train and upskill themselves in, I would say, in understanding energy and the various aspects of it, innovation in new technology in respect to the source of its fuel, the food stock for fuel, what that looks like. That is where we have to direct our training in our people, and we have to continue that way.
Great. Good. Thank you. And as we wrap up, do you have anything else you want to add, Ivan, on that in terms of skills?
I believe, Peter, the most important challenge we face in the global south today is how are we going to be able to massify in the ecosystems the payment for ecosystemical services. And that has to be sustainable, scalable, and replicable. And it can only happen in a definition of what Concordia is and why this organization exists. Public-private partnerships. We need that element there. It's the only way that we're going to be able to recover the land that we have lost.
Yep.
It's going to be the only way in which we can involve communities on the conservation economy. And I think it'll also be able to give the world the urgency to look at biodiverse paradises that we have in the world to have a global biodiversity product so that we know what's the value of those natural assets, and we are able, through the TFFF, to mobilize that capital in the years to come.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
My feeling, as we do close this up, is that if we do not establish nature as an investable asset class, where private capital can flow and people can profit, we don't actually stand a chance of generating the financing that's required. And that's why we created Sylvania. That's what CI is focusing. It's what we are all thinking about. How do we do that? And that's where the brain power that's in this room has to engage. So thank you all so much for
Thank you so much.
participating.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.